My name is Helen Evans. I am 70 years old, though I rarely say that number out loud, and I have lived most of my life in the Pacific Northwest, where the rain is as constant as the memories that fill my days. I have always been the kind of woman who keeps her hands busy and her thoughts to herself, a habit formed from decades of raising a daughter alone after my husband passed away far too young. My world has always been small but solid: a modest house in Tacoma, a garden that blooms every spring, and my daughter Emily, who has been both my pride and my purpose for as long as I can remember. It was a Tuesday morning in late February when the first warning arrived, though at the time it felt like nothing more than a minor inconvenience. I was sitting at my kitchen table, sorting through the usual stack of mail bills, advertisements, a postcard from an old friend in Arizona when I noticed an envelope from the bank. The return address was familiar, but the contents were not. Inside was a notice about a late payment on a home equity line of credit, referencing an address that was not my own. My heart gave a small, uncertain flutter as I read the details, the numbers and dates blurring together in a way that made me feel suddenly, inexplicably old. I set the letter aside, telling myself it was probably a clerical error, a mix-up that would resolve itself with a phone call, but as I moved through the rest of my day, the unease lingered, a quiet ache in the back of my mind. I thought of Emily, of her new life with Tyler in the suburbs north of Seattle, the house they had bought together just 2 years earlier. I remembered the day she called me, voice trembling with excitement, to say they had found the perfect place, a two-story with a wide porch and enough space for the family she hoped to have. I had been so proud, so willing to help, that I barely hesitated when she asked me to co-sign her mortgage. It was a small thing, I told myself, a way to give her the security I had always wanted for her. That evening, as the sky darkened and the rain began to fall in earnest, I called Emily. She answered on the third ring, her voice bright but distracted, as if she were already halfway out the door. I asked her about the bank notice, trying to keep my tone light, but she brushed it off, saying Tyler handled all the bills and that everything was fine. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to trust that she would tell me if something was wrong. But as I hung up the phone, I felt a heaviness settle in my chest, a sense that something important was shifting just beyond my reach. The next morning, I drove to Emily's house, the letter from the bank folded neatly in my purse. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where children's bicycles lay abandoned on front lawns and every mailbox was painted a cheerful color. Emily's house looked the same as always: white siding, blue shutters, a wreath on the door that I had made for her last Christmas. But as I walked up the path, I noticed the grass was longer than usual, the flower beds choked with weeds. It was a small thing, but it struck me as a sign, a subtle unraveling of the order I had always associated with my daughter. Emily greeted me at the door, her smile quick and practiced. She hugged me, but her arms felt stiff, her body tense. Inside, the house was cluttered in a way that suggested more than just a busy life. There were unopened boxes in the hallway, stacks of mail on the kitchen counter, and a faint smell of something burnt lingering in the air. Tyler was not home, which was a relief. I had never been entirely comfortable around him, though I tried to hide it for Emily's sake. He was charming in a way that always felt rehearsed, his laughter too loud, his stories too polished. He worked in sales, or so he said, but I had never seen any evidence of steady employment. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had once helped Emily with her homework, and I showed her the letter from the bank. She glanced at it, her eyes skimming the words without really reading them, and told me again that Tyler was handling everything. I pressed a little harder, asking if she was sure, if there was anything she wanted to tell me. She shook her head, her jaw set in that stubborn line I remembered from her childhood. I let it go, not wanting to push her away, but I made a mental note to look into it myself. That afternoon, while Emily was upstairs putting the baby down for a nap, I wandered through the house, taking in the small details that spoke of a life under strain. There were past due notices tucked behind the toaster, credit card statements with balances circled in red ink, and a stack of unopened envelopes from various lenders. I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me as I realized the extent of the problem. This was not a simple oversight or a temporary setback. This was something deeper, something that threatened to unravel everything I had worked so hard to build. I left the house quietly, not wanting to disturb Emily or risk a confrontation. As I drove home, the rain beating against the windshield, I tried to make sense of what I had seen. I thought of all the years spent worrying about Emily, all the sacrifices made for her better life. I wondered if I had done too much, if my desire to protect her had somehow made her vulnerable to the very dangers I had tried to shield her from. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, the bank letter spread out before me, and began to make a list. I wrote down every detail I could remember: dates, amounts, names of lenders. I searched through my own files, pulling out the mortgage documents I had signed with Emily, the statements I had kept out of habit. The next morning, I called the bank, pretending to be Emily, and asked about the late payment. The woman on the other end of the line was polite but firm, confirming that several payments had been missed and that the account was now in arrears. I thanked her, my voice steady, and hung up the phone with a sense of grim determination. I spent the next few days gathering information, piecing together the puzzle of Emily's finances. I visited the county records office, where a kind clerk helped me look up the title to the house. I discovered that a second mortgage had been taken out just 6 months earlier, and that Tyler's name appeared on several loan documents. The amounts were staggering, far more than I had imagined possible. I felt a mixture of anger and fear, a sense of betrayal that cut deeper than I cared to admit. I knew I needed to confront Tyler, but I wanted to be prepared. I made copies of every document, organized them in a folder, and rehearsed what I would say. I told myself I would remain calm, that I would not let him provoke me. I had spent a lifetime learning to control my emotions, to keep my voice steady even when my heart was breaking. I would not let him see how much this hurt me. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. Tyler called me one afternoon, his tone unusually friendly, inviting me to meet him for coffee. I agreed, sensing that he wanted something from me. We met at a small cafe near his office, a place filled with the hum of conversation and the smell of burnt espresso. He was already seated when I arrived, his phone on the table, his eyes scanning the room as if looking for an escape. I sat down across from him, my folder of documents resting on my lap. We exchanged pleasantries, but the conversation quickly turned to money. Tyler spoke in vague terms about temporary setbacks and unexpected expenses, assuring me that everything was under control. I listened, nodding politely. But when he finished, I opened the folder and slid the documents across the table. He glanced at them, his expression shifting from annoyance to alarm. I watched as he scanned the pages, his fingers drumming nervously on the tabletop. He tried to laugh it off, to make excuses, but I could see the fear in his eyes. I told him what I had learned, laying out the facts in a calm, measured voice. I asked him how he planned to repay the loans, how he intended to keep the house from slipping away. Tyler grew defensive, his words sharp and hurried. He accused me of meddling, of trying to undermine his authority in front of Emily. He said I didn't understand, that things were more complicated than they appeared. I listened, letting him vent. But I did not back down. I told him I would not allow my daughter's future to be gambled away, that I would do whatever was necessary to protect her. The conversation ended abruptly, with Tyler storming out of the cafe, leaving his half-finished coffee behind. I sat there for a long time, staring at the empty chair across from me, feeling the weight of what had just happened. I knew that I had crossed a line, that there would be consequences for my actions. But I also knew that I could not turn back. Not now. Not after everything I had seen. When I returned home, I found myself unable to relax. I moved through the rooms of my house, straightening cushions, watering plants, anything to keep my hands busy. I thought of Emily, of the little girl who used to curl up in my lap and ask me to read her favorite stories. I wondered if she would ever forgive me for what I was about to do. That night, as I lay in bed listening to the rain, I made a promise to myself. I would not let fear or guilt dictate my actions. I would face whatever came next with the same quiet strength that had carried me through every hardship of my life. I would protect my daughter, even if it meant losing her in the process. The days that followed were a blur of phone calls, paperwork, and sleepless nights. I spoke with a lawyer, an old friend from my church group, who explained my rights as a co owner of the house. She told me that I had options, that I was not powerless. I felt a flicker of hope, a sense that I might still be able to salvage something from the wreckage. But even as I gathered my resources, I could feel the distance growing between Emily and me. She stopped answering my calls, responding only with brief, clipped text messages. When I visited her house, she met me at the door, her face closed and unreadable. She told me that Tyler was handling everything, that I needed to trust her. I wanted to believe her, but the evidence was overwhelming. One afternoon, as I was leaving her house, I caught a glimpse of Emily standing at the window, her arms wrapped around herself, her eyes fixed on something far away. I wondered what she was thinking, if she felt as lost and afraid as I did. I wanted to reach out to her, to tell her that I loved her, that I was only trying to help, but the words caught in my throat, and I drove away in silence. At home, I sat at my desk, surrounded by stacks of paper, and tried to make sense of it all. I thought of the years I had spent building a life for Emily, the sacrifices I had made, the dreams I had for her future. I wondered if any of it had mattered, if I had done more harm than good. I felt old, tired, and very much alone. But beneath the sadness, there was a core of resolve, a quiet determination that had always been my greatest strength. I would not give up. I would not let Tyler's recklessness destroy everything I had worked for all my life. I would fight, not with anger or bitterness, but with the steady, patient persistence that had carried me through a lifetime of storms. As the rain continued to fall outside my window, I began to plan my next move. I knew the road ahead would be difficult, that there would be more pain before there was any hope of healing. But I also knew that I was not alone. Not really. I had my memories, my faith, and the unshakable conviction that I was doing the right thing, no matter how much it hurt. And so, with the quiet strength that comes from a lifetime of loving and losing, I prepared myself for the battle to come. I would protect my daughter, even if it meant standing against her. I would not let fear or regret dictate my actions. I would face the storm, as I always had, with my head held high and my heart unbroken. I have always believed that the hardest truths are the ones we try the most to ignore. In the days that followed my confrontation with Tyler, I found myself moving through a fog of uncertainty, each step heavier than the last. I had always thought of myself as a practical woman, someone who could face reality head on. But nothing in my life had prepared me for the quiet ache of being shut out by my own child. The house felt colder, the hours longer, and the silence more profound than I remembered. I tried to keep busy, filling my days with small tasks: laundry, baking, tending to the garden, but nothing could distract me from the growing sense of dread that settled in my chest. It was a Thursday afternoon when I decided to try again. I drove to Emily's house, rehearsing my words as I navigated the familiar streets. The sky was overcast, the air heavy with the promise of rain. I parked at the curb, taking a moment to steady myself before walking up the path. The house looked unchanged from the outside, but as I stepped onto the porch, I noticed a pile of unopened mail wedged into the mailbox, some of it already damp from the drizzle. I knocked, waiting for the sound of footsteps, the familiar creak of the floorboards, but instead, the door opened abruptly, and Emily stood before me, her face pale and drawn. She did not invite me in, but stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her eyes wary. I saw the tension in her shoulders, her jaw clenched as she waited for me to speak. I told her I was worried, that I had seen the notices, that I knew about the second mortgage and the missed payments. I tried to keep my voice gentle, but I could hear the tremor in it, the desperation I could not quite hide. Emily shook her head, her lips pressed into a thin line. She insisted that I was mistaken, that Tyler had explained everything, that there was nothing to worry about. I could see the fear in her eyes, the way she looked past me as if searching for an escape. I wanted to reach out, to take her hand, to remind her of all the times I had held her through storms, both real and imagined, but she stepped back, her body rigid, and told me to leave it alone. She said I was making things worse, that I was interfering in her marriage, that I needed to trust her judgment. The words stung, sharper than I expected, and for a moment I could not find my voice. I tried to explain, to show her the documents I had gathered, but she refused to look at them. She told me that if I could not support her, I should stay away. I left the porch in silence, the weight of her words heavy on me. As I walked back to my car, I glanced over my shoulder and saw her standing in the doorway, arms still crossed, her face set in a mask of defiance. I wondered if she would ever forgive me for what I had done, or if this was the beginning of a distance that would never be bridged. The drive home was a blur, the rain streaking the windshield, the world outside as gray and uncertain as my thoughts. At home, I sat in the living room, the quiet broken only by the ticking of the old clock on the mantel. I tried to read, to lose myself in the comfort of familiar stories, but the words blurred on the page. I thought of Emily as a child, her laughter echoing through the house, her small hand tucked into mine as we walked to the park. I remembered the promises I had made to her, the dreams I had for her future. And I wondered where I had gone wrong. I replayed the conversation in my mind, searching for a moment when I could have said something different, something that might have changed the outcome. The days passed slowly, each one marked by a growing sense of isolation. I called Emily, leaving messages that went unanswered. I sent her texts, short notes filled with love and concern. But she did not reply. I told myself that she needed time, that she would come around. But as the silence stretched on, hope gave way to resignation. I began to understand that there are some wounds that cannot be healed with words, some distances that cannot be crossed no matter how much we long to bridge them. I tried to fill my emptiness with routine. I baked bread, kneaded the dough until my arms ached, the familiar rhythm a small comfort in the midst of uncertainty. I tended to my garden, pulling weeds and pruning roses, the scent of earth and flowers grounding me when my thoughts threatened to spiral. I visited the library, checked out books I had read a dozen times before, their well-worn pages a reminder of simpler days. But no matter how I tried to distract myself, the ache remained, a constant companion in the quiet hours of the night. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, the phone rang. For a moment, my heart leapt, hope flaring that it might be Emily. But when I answered, it was Tyler's voice on the other end, cold and clipped. He told me to stop interfering, to mind my own business, to let them handle their affairs. He accused me of trying to ruin their marriage, of sowing discord where there was none. I listened in silence, the anger in his words washing over me like a wave. When he hung up, I stood in the kitchen, the receiver still pressed to my ear, the silence that followed heavier than any argument. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the shadows shifting across the walls. I thought of all the things I wanted to say to Emily, all the apologies and explanations that now seemed pointless. I wondered if she would ever understand that everything I had done was out of love, that my only wish was to protect her from harm. But as the hours passed, I realized that there are some lessons we must learn for ourselves, some truths that cannot be given, only discovered. The next morning, I woke to a house that felt emptier than ever. The sun struggled to break through the clouds, casting a pale light across the kitchen table. I made coffee, the familiar ritual offering little comfort. I sat by the window, watching the world go by, the quiet punctuated only by the distant sound of children playing in the street. I wondered if Emily was thinking of me, if she missed the warmth of our old conversations, the easy laughter that once filled our days. I tried to write her a letter, the words coming slowly, each sentence a struggle. I told her that I loved her, that I would always be here if she needed me, that nothing could ever change the bond between us. I folded the letter, placed it in an envelope as signs, and set it on the mantel, unsure if I would ever send it. It felt like a small act of hope in a world that had grown uncertain and cold. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself withdrawing from the world. I declined invitations from friends, skipped church services, and let the answering machine pick up calls. I told myself that I needed time to heal, to come to terms with the new shape of my life. But in truth, I was afraid of facing the pity in their eyes, the questions I could not answer, the sympathy I did not want. I'd always prided myself on my strength, my ability to weather any storm, but this was a different kind of pain, one that left me feeling exposed and vulnerable. I spent long hours in the garden, the work a balm for my restless mind. I watched the seasons change, the first buds of spring giving way to the lush green of early summer. I found comfort in the small miracles of growth and renewal, the reminder that life goes on, even when our hearts are broken. I thought of Emily often, wondering how she was managing, if she had found a way to make peace with the choices she had made. One afternoon, as I was trimming the hedges, a neighbor stopped by, her arms full of fresh cut flowers. She asked how I was doing, her voice gentle, her eyes kind. I smiled, thanked her for the flowers, and told her I was fine. It was a lie, but one I had grown accustomed to telling. I did not want to burden her with my troubles, did not want to admit how lost I felt. We chatted for a few minutes about the weather, the state of the garden, the latest news from the neighborhood. When she left, I stood in the yard, the scent of lilies and roses lingering in the air, and felt a pang of longing for the days when life had felt simpler, when love had seemed enough to hold a family together. That evening, I sat on the porch, watching the sunset behind the trees, the sky painted in shades of gold and pink. I thought of all the things I wished I could say to Emily, all the ways I wanted to reach out and bridge the distance between us. But I knew that some journeys must be made alone, that some lessons can only be learned through hardship and loss. I whispered a prayer for her, for strength and wisdom, for the courage to face whatever lay ahead. As the weeks passed, I began to accept the new rhythm of my days. I found solace in routine, in the quiet moments of reflection that filled the hours. I learned to live with the ache of absence, to carry the weight of regret without letting it define me. I reminded myself that love is not always enough to save the ones we care about, that sometimes the best we can do is let go and trust that they will find their own way. I kept the letter to Emily on the mantel, a silent testament to the love that endured despite the distance. I told myself that one day, when the time was right, I would send it. Until then, I would wait, holding on to hope. Even as the world around me changed, in the quiet of those long days, I found a kind of peace. It was not the peace I had hoped for, not the easy comfort of a family reunited, but a deeper, more enduring calm, the knowledge that I had done all I could, that I had acted out of love, even when it was misunderstood. I learned to forgive myself for the things I could not change, to accept the limits of my own strength. And so, as the seasons turned and the world moved on, I remained a quiet presence on the edge of Emily's life, waiting for the day when she might reach out, when the distance between us might finally be bridged. Until then, I would carry her in my heart, a constant reminder of the love that endures, even in the face of silence. The weeks after my last visit to Emily's house felt suspended, as if time itself had slowed. I moved through my days with quiet determination, clinging to routines. But my mind was restless. I sensed I was on the edge of something irreversible, that every decision now would echo for years. The ache of distance from my daughter settled into a deeper resignation, but also a resolve I hadn't felt in a long time. One silent afternoon, I realized I couldn't do this alone. I'd always prided myself on independence, but this was different. The risks were too great. I needed someone who understood property law, someone to help me navigate the legal maze that now defined my relationship with Emily and Tyler. I thought of Linda Tran, a friend from church who had been a real estate attorney. We'd lost touch, but I remembered her warmth and fairness. I found her number in an old address book, the pages soft from years of use. My hand trembled as I dialed, unsure if she'd remember me or be willing to help. When she answered, her voice was as calm as I remembered. I explained my situation, careful to keep my emotions in check, and she listened. She told me to bring every letter, statement, and scrap of paper. She promised to look it all over carefully and help me understand my options. That evening, I gathered my documents, organizing them by date and type. I found the original mortgage agreement, my signature beside Emily's. The ink faded, but legible. I found the bank notices, statements showing missed payments, and the second mortgage with Tyler's hurried signature. I placed everything in a manila envelope. My heart felt heavy, but my mind clear. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the pile of papers, feeling the weight of every decision I had made for Emily's sake over the years. I wondered if she would ever see this as an act of love, or only as a betrayal. The next day, I drove to Linda's house. She greeted me with a warm hug, her eyes kind. We sat at her kitchen table, and I laid out the documents. She read each one carefully, pausing at times to ask a question or make a note in the margin. When she finished, she said, "You have more power here than you think." Linda explained that as a co-owner, my rights were not just symbolic. I had a legal stake in the property, and if I believed my investment was at risk, I could take action. She told me about a partition by sale, a process that would allow me to force the sale of the house if the other owners refused to cooperate. It was a drastic step, she warned, one that would almost certainly destroy any hope of reconciliation with Emily. But it was also a way to prevent Tyler's recklessness from dragging us all down. She spoke gently, but she did not sugarcoat the consequences. I appreciated her honesty, even as it made my heart ache. I listened, weighing her words. The idea of forcing Emily out of her home was almost unbearable, but the alternative, watching everything I'd worked for slip away, was worse. Linda offered to help me find a reputable real estate agent, someone who could assess the house's value and guide me through the process. I thanked her, feeling both relief and dread. For the first time in months, I felt I had a path forward, even if it was one I'd never wanted. That night, I lay awake, turning Linda's advice over in my mind. I thought of Emily, the life she'd built, the memories we'd shared. I wondered if she'd ever forgive me for what I was about to do, or if this would be the final break. But I also thought of the years I'd spent working 2 jobs, saving every penny, sacrificing my own comfort for her future. I reminded myself that love sometimes means making hard choices, and that protecting someone does not always look the way we wish it would. The following week, I met with Jake Miller, the real estate agent Linda recommended. He was younger than I expected, with a quiet confidence. We sat in his office, surrounded by photos of families smiling in front of new homes, and I explained my situation. He listened, asked questions, and assured me he'd handle everything with discretion. He promised a fair market analysis and to walk me through each step if I decided to proceed. Jake's professionalism was a comfort. He explained the logistics of a partition sale, the timelines, the likely outcomes. He didn't sugarcoat the difficulties, but he didn't try to dissuade me. He understood the pain of watching a family unravel over money and trust. I left his office with a folder of information and a sense of clarity. In the days that followed, I prepared for what was to come. I reviewed the documents Linda had marked, made lists of questions, and started moving some belongings into storage, a quiet act of self-preservation. I told myself I wasn't running away, but making space for whatever came next. I spent hours sorting through old photographs, deciding which memories to keep close and which to pack away. Each item I boxed up felt like a small goodbye to the life I had built for Emily and myself. During this time, Tyler appeared at my door. It was late afternoon, the sky heavy with rain. He demanded to know why I was digging into their business. His words were sharp. But beneath the anger, I sensed fear. I stood my ground, refusing to be intimidated. I told him I was only trying to protect my investment, that I had a right to know what was happening. He accused me of meddling, but I did not back down. I had spent too many years swallowing my own needs for others. I would not do it again. After Tyler left, I sat in my living room, the echoes of his anger still ringing. I felt a strange sense of calm, as if a decision had been made for me, though. I knew there was no going back. I called Linda and Jake, letting them know I was ready to proceed. We set a date to begin the process, to gather documents and file the paperwork. I heard the quiet relief in Linda's voice, the way she reassured me that I was not alone in this. In the days that followed, I moved with purpose. I met with Linda to review legal forms, signing my name with a steady hand. I worked with Jake to schedule an appraisal, providing every detail he needed. I began to transfer some savings into a separate account, a small act of self-protection. I told myself I wasn't abandoning Emily, but giving her the chance to start over. I tried to imagine what her life might look like after all this, and whether she would ever want me to be part of it again. Throughout it all, I kept my emotions in check, refusing to let guilt cloud my judgment. I reminded myself I was acting out of love, even if it didn't look that way. I thought of the years I'd spent building a life for Emily, the sacrifices, the dreams. Sometimes love means letting go, allowing those we care about to face the consequences of their choices. I found myself praying for her, for the strength to face what was coming, and for the wisdom to forgive me someday. As the paperwork moved forward, I found myself growing more detached from the outcome. I no longer checked my phone for messages from Emily, no longer waited for her to reach out. I focused on the tasks at hand, on protecting myself and my future. I spent long hours in the garden, the work of comfort in uncertainty. I watched the seasons change, the first hints of autumn coloring the leaves. The air grew cooler, and I found solace in the rhythm of nature, in the knowledge that life moves forward, even when we feel stuck. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sunset, I felt a sense of peace. It was not the peace of resolution, but the calm that comes from knowing you have done all you can. I thought of Emily, of the life she had built and the choices she had made. I hoped that one day she would understand, that she would see everything I had done was out of love. But I also knew I could not control her journey. I could only try to walk my own path with integrity and grace. The day we filed the paperwork was gray and rainy. Linda and I met at the courthouse, our steps echoing in the marble halls. We submitted the forms, our signatures side by side. A quiet act of courage. Jake called later to confirm the appraisal was scheduled, his voice steady and reassuring. I remember standing outside the courthouse, watching the rain fall, feeling both lighter and heavier at the same time. In the weeks that followed, I moved through my days with quiet determination. I continued to prepare, organizing my finances, making arrangements for the future. I spoke with Linda and Jake regularly, their support a steady presence. I found comfort in the routines that had always sustained me. I started attending church again, letting the familiar hymns and prayers fill the empty spaces in my heart. Tyler did not return, and Emily remained silent. I wondered if she knew what was happening, if she understood the gravity of the situation. I hoped she would find the strength to face the truth, but I also knew I could not force her to see what she was not ready to see. I could only offer her the gift of my honesty, the example of my own resilience. As the process moved forward, then I began to feel a sense of release. The burden I had carried for so long, the fear, the guilt, the responsibility began to lift. I realized I had done all I could, that I had acted with integrity and love. Sometimes we must make choices that break our own hearts to protect the ones we love. In the quiet of those autumn evenings, I found a new kind of strength. It was not the strength of certainty, but the resilience that comes from surviving loss and disappointment. I learned to trust myself, to accept the limits of my power. I reminded myself I was not alone, that I had friends and allies who cared for me. I even allowed myself to hope that, in time, Emily might reach out again. As the leaves fell and the days grew shorter, I prepared for whatever came next. I knew the road ahead would not be easy, but I was ready. I carried with me the lessons of a lifetime, the importance of honesty, the value of resilience, the power of love. And so, as the world outside changed, I changed with it. I let go of the past and embraced the future with open hands. I trusted that, in time, Emily would find her way. Until then, I would walk my own path, guided by the quiet strength that had always been my greatest gift. The day the legal petition was filed, the air felt heavier than usual, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I had known this moment would come, but nothing could have prepared me for the strange mix of relief and sorrow that settled over me as I left the courthouse. The process had been so quiet, so methodical signatures, notarized forms, a polite clerk who barely looked up as she stamped the documents that would change the course of my family's life. I remember the sound of the stamp, sharp and final, echoing in my mind long after I stepped back out into the gray afternoon. I drove home in silence, the city passing by in a blur of wet pavement and red lights. I kept thinking about Emily, wondering if she would sense the shift, if she would feel the ground moving beneath her feet. I imagined her at home, perhaps folding laundry or making dinner, unaware that the foundation of her world was about to crack. I wondered if she would blame me, or if she would finally see that I had done everything I could to avoid this outcome. The truth was, I had run out of options. I had tried to talk, to reason, to wait for her to come to her senses, but the silence between us had grown too wide and the risks too great. The days that followed were filled with a strange, anxious energy. I found myself checking the mailbox more often, waiting for the official notice that would be delivered to Emily and Tyler. I imagined their reactions: confusion, anger, maybe even fear. I tried not to dwell on it, but it was impossible to keep my mind from wandering into those dark places. I busied myself with small tasks, cleaning out closets, organizing drawers, anything to keep my hands moving and my thoughts at bay. When the notice was finally served, it was as if a storm had broken. I received a flurry of calls and messages, first from Tyler, then from Emily. Their voices were tight, brittle with panic. Tyler's words were sharp, accusing me of betrayal, of destroying their lives. Emily's messages were softer, but no less desperate. She pleaded with me to reconsider, to find another way, to remember the love that had always bound us together. I listened to each message, my heart aching, but I did not respond. I knew that any conversation now would only lead to more pain, more misunderstanding. The time for words had passed. The only thing left was to let the process unfold. I spent those days in a kind of limbo, suspended between the past and the future. I walked through my house, touching the familiar objects that had once brought me comfort: a photograph of Emily as a child, a quilt I had sewn by hand, the chipped mug I used for my morning coffee. Each item felt heavier now, weighted with memories and regret. I wondered if I would ever be able to look at them the same way again. The tension in the air was palpable. I could feel it in the way my neighbors glanced at me, their eyes full of questions they were too polite to ask. I could sense it in the way the phone rang late at night, the silence on the other end more telling than any words. I tried to keep my routine and hold on to the small rituals that had always grounded me, but everything felt different now. The world had shifted, and I was struggling to find my footing. One afternoon, as I was watering the garden, I saw Emily's car pull up to the curb. She sat there for a long moment, her hands gripping the steering wheel, her face hidden in shadow. I watched from the window, my heart pounding, unsure if I wanted her to come inside or drive away. Eventually, that she stepped out, her movement slow and uncertain. She walked up the path, pausing at the door before finally knocking. I opened the door, and for a moment we simply stood there, two women separated by years of love and recent pain. Emily's eyes were red, her voice trembling as she asked me why I was doing this. I wanted to reach out, to hold her, to explain that I had no choice, that I had tried everything else, but the words caught in my throat, and all I could do was shake my head. She pleaded with me to stop the process, to give her more time, and to trust that she and Tyler could fix things. I listened, my heart breaking, but I knew it was too late. The machinery was in motion, and there was no way to turn it back. After she left, I sat in the quiet of my living room, the echo of her voice lingering in the air. I wondered if I had made a terrible mistake, if there was still some path I had overlooked, but every time I tried to imagine another way, I came back to the same hard truth: I could not save Emily from the consequences of her choices. I could only protect what little remained of the life I had built. The days grew shorter, the air colder. I found myself retreating further into solitude, avoiding calls, letting messages go unanswered. I spent long hours in the garden, the work a comfort against the uncertainty that pressed in from all sides. I watched the leaves turn and fall, the world outside mirroring the changes within my own heart. I tried to remind myself that this was not the end, that there was still hope for healing, even if I could not see it yet. As the legal process moved forward and the tension only increased, Tyler became more aggressive, leaving angry voicemails, threatening to fight the petition in court. Emily's messages shifted from pleading to resignation, her words growing shorter, more distant. I could feel her slipping away. The bond between us was stretched to its breaking point. I tried to hold on to the memory of better days, to the laughter and warmth that had once filled our lives, but it felt like trying to grasp water in my hands. There were moments when I questioned everything: my decisions, my motives, even my own strength. I wondered if I had been too harsh, too quick to act. I replayed every conversation, every missed opportunity, searching for the moment when things might have turned out differently. But the past was fixed, and the future uncertain. All I could do was move forward, one step at a time. The court set a date for the first hearing, and I found myself preparing for it with the same quiet determination that had carried me through so many storms. I gathered my documents, reviewed the facts, rehearsed what I would say if called upon to speak. I tried to steel myself against the pain of seeing Emily and Tyler in that setting, knowing that whatever happened, nothing would ever be the same. On the morning of the hearing, I dressed carefully, choosing a simple dress and the pearl earrings Emily had given me years ago. I wanted to carry a piece of her with me, a reminder of the love that still lingered beneath the hurt. The courthouse was cold and impersonal, the waiting room filled with strangers whose lives were also in turmoil. I sat quietly, my hands folded in my lap, listening to the distant hum of voices and the shuffle of papers. When our case was called, I stood and walked into the courtroom, my heart pounding. Emily and Tyler sat together, their faces drawn and tense. I avoided their eyes, focusing instead on the judge, the lawyers, the steady rhythm of the proceedings. The arguments were made, the documents reviewed, the judge's questions answered. It was all so formal, so detached, a far cry from the messy, complicated reality of our lives. After the hearing, I left the courthouse alone, the outcome still uncertain. I walked through the city, the cold air biting at my cheeks, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I thought of Emily, of the pain in her eyes, the way she had looked at me as if I were a stranger. I wondered if she would ever forgive me, or if this was the final chapter in a story that had once been so full of hope. In the weeks that followed, the legal process continued its slow, relentless march. There were more hearings, more documents, more moments of doubt and fear. I tried to keep my focus, to remember why I had started down this path. I reminded myself that I was not acting out of anger or spite, but out of a deep, abiding love, a love that sometimes required letting go. The tension in the family reached a breaking point. Tyler stopped calling, his anger replaced by a cold silence. Emily withdrew completely, her messages growing infrequent and brief. I missed her more than I could say, but I knew that reaching out now would only make things worse. I tried to find comfort in the small things: the warmth of a cup of tea, the softness of a well-worn blanket, the quiet beauty of the garden as it settled into winter. One evening, as I sat by the window watching the first snowfall, I allowed myself to hope that, in time, Emily would come to understand. I hoped that she would see that I had acted not out of malice, but out of necessity. I hoped that one day, the distance between us would shrink, and we could find our way back to each other. Until then, I would wait, holding on to the quiet strength that had carried me this far. The legal process was not yet over, but I had learned to live with the uncertainty. I had learned to trust myself, to accept the limits of my power, to believe that even in the midst of loss, there could still be moments of grace. I carried Emily in my heart, a constant reminder of the love that endures, even when everything else falls away. Sometimes, late at night, I would find myself whispering a prayer for her, for forgiveness, for peace, for the chance to begin again, no matter how long it might take. The first sign that the end was truly coming was the for sale sign that appeared in front of Emily's house. I had known it was inevitable, but seeing the white post planted in the yard, the bold red letters announcing to the world that this chapter was closing, brought a finality I had not expected. Jake called me that morning to let me know the listing was live, his voice steady and professional, but I could hear the sympathy beneath his words. He told me there had already been calls from interested buyers, that the market was strong, and that things would likely move quickly. I thanked him, my voice calm. But after I hung up, I sat down at my kitchen table for a long time, staring at nothing, letting the reality settle in. I imagined Emily seeing the sign, perhaps from her window or as she pulled into the driveway. I wondered if she felt anger, or grief, or simply exhaustion. I wondered if she blamed me, or if she had finally come to understand that this was the only way forward. The house had always been more than just a building to me. It was the place where I had watched her grow, where I had celebrated birthdays and holidays, where I had believed, for a time, that love and hard work could protect us from the world. Now it was just another property on the market, its history reduced to a few lines in a listing, its future uncertain. The days that followed were filled with a strange quiet. I no longer received calls from Tyler, and Emily's messages had stopped altogether. The silence was both a relief and a wound, a space where regret and hope mingled in equal measure. I tried to keep busy by tending to my garden, sorting through old photographs, preparing for the changes that were coming. I often found myself thinking of the past, the choices I had made, the moments when things might have turned out differently. I wondered if I would ever stop asking myself those questions. Jake kept me updated as the process moved forward. There were showings almost every day, and within a week, several offers had come in. He explained the details, the contingencies, the timelines, but it all felt distant, as if it were happening to someone else. I signed the necessary documents, trusting him to handle the negotiations, to make the best decisions for all involved. I tried not to think about the people who walked through the house. I imagined their own lives unfolding in those rooms, unaware of the history that lingered in the walls. As the closing date approached, I felt a growing sense of finality. I knew that once the sale was complete, there would be no going back, no chance to undo what had been set in motion. I tried to prepare myself for that moment, to accept that this was the end of something I had cherished for so long. I reminded myself that I had done what was necessary, that I had acted out of love, even if it did not look that way from the outside. One afternoon, as I was returning from the grocery store, I saw Emily sitting on the steps of my porch. She looked smaller than I remembered, her shoulders hunched, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. For a moment, I hesitated, unsure if I should approach her or give her space. But as I walked up the path, she looked up, her eyes red and tired. She handed me a letter, her fingers trembling, and stood to leave. I wanted to reach out, to hold her, to tell her that everything would be all right, but the words would not come. Instead, I watched as she walked away, her figure growing smaller with each step. Inside, I sat at the kitchen table and opened the letter. Emily's handwriting was shaky, the words crowded together as if she had written them in a hurry. She apologized for everything, for not listening, for pushing me away, for letting things get so far out of control. She wrote about Tyler, about the arguments and the fear, about the sense of helplessness that had settled over her life. She told me she understood now why I had done what I did, that she wished she had seen it sooner, that she hoped one day I could forgive her. She ended the letter with a simple plea. Please don't give up on me. Mom. I read the letter twice, my hands shaking, tears blurring the words. I wanted to call her, to tell her that I had never given up, that I never would, but I knew that healing would take time, that the wounds between us were still too raw. I placed the letter in a drawer with the other keepsakes, a silent promise to myself that I would hold on to hope, no matter how long it took. The day of the closing arrived with little fanfare. Jake called to confirm that everything had gone smoothly, that the funds had been transferred, that the house now belonged to someone else. I thanked him, my voice steady, and hung up the phone. I sat in the quiet of my living room, the weight of the past months pressing down on me. I thought of Emily, of the life we had shared, of the future that was now unwritten. I allowed myself to grieve, to feel the loss, to acknowledge the pain that came with letting go. In the days that followed, I tried to find comfort in small things, the warmth of the sun on my face, the scent of fresh coffee in the morning, the gentle rhythm of the rain against the window. I reminded myself that endings are also beginnings, that loss can make room for new growth, that love endures even when everything else falls away. I did not know what the future would hold for Emily or for myself, but I trusted that we would find our way, in our own time, in our own way. Sometimes, late at night, I would take out Emily's letter and read it again, letting her words settle over me like a balm. I would whisper a prayer for her, for forgiveness, for peace, for the chance to begin again. And in those quiet moments, I felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that, even in the midst of loss, there was still room for healing, for reconciliation, for love to find its way home. As the weeks passed, I noticed small changes in myself. The heaviness that had settled over me for so long began to lift, little by little. I found myself lingering in the garden, watching the first green shoots push through the soil, feeling a quiet satisfaction in the simple act of nurturing something new. I started to reach out to old friends, accepting invitations for coffee or a walk in the park, allowing myself to be drawn back into the gentle rhythms of community. I realized that, even as one chapter closed, another was beginning, and that I still had the capacity for joy, for connection, for hope. I thought often of Emily, wondering how she was adjusting to her new reality. I imagined her packing boxes, saying goodbye to the house that had been her home, searching for a place to start over. I hoped she would find strength in herself, that she would remember the lessons I had tried to teach her, that she would forgive herself as I had forgiven her. I knew that our relationship would never be the same, but I believed that when in time, we could build something new, something honest, something resilient, something rooted in the hard-won wisdom of experience. There were days when the ache of loss returned, sharp and sudden, catching me off guard. I would find myself standing in the kitchen, holding a mug or a photograph, and feel the weight of all that had been lost, but I also felt gratitude for the years we had shared, for the love that had endured, for the chance to begin again. I learned to carry both the sorrow and the hope, to let them exist side by side. They shaped me into someone stronger, more compassionate, more open to the possibilities of the future. As spring turned to summer, I found myself looking forward more often than looking back. I made plans for small trips, for afternoons spent reading in the sun, for evenings with friends and laughter. I allowed myself to dream again, to imagine a life that was not defined by regret or loss, but by the quiet, steady pursuit of peace. I knew that healing was not a destination, but a journey, and that I was still walking that path, step by step, day by day. And always, in the quiet moments before sleep, I would think of Emily, sending her silent wishes for happiness, for courage, for love. I trusted that wherever she was finding her own way, just as I was finding mine. And in that trust, I found a measure of peace, a sense that no matter how much had changed, the bond between us would endure, quietly, steadfastly, through all the seasons of our lives. Sometimes, I would even imagine a day when she might return, not to the old house, but to a new understanding between us, and I would be ready, with open arms and an open heart. After the house was sold and the last papers were signed, I found myself standing at the edge of a life I no longer recognized. The routines that had once filled my days checking the mailbox for news, waiting for calls that never came, worrying over every detail of Emily's world slowly faded into the background. In their place was a quiet, unfamiliar freedom, a sense of space I had not felt in years. For the first time in a long while, I was not responsible for anyone but myself. The realization was both liberating and unsettling, as if I had stepped out onto a wide plain with no map, no destination, and only the horizon ahead. I spent the first weeks after the sale in a kind of gentle daze, moving through my house with a new awareness. The rooms felt larger, the air lighter. I noticed the way the morning sun fell across the kitchen table, the way the garden seemed to breathe in the early hours. I took long walks through the neighborhood, letting my mind wander, allowing myself to feel the ache of loss and the quiet thrill of possibility. I began to imagine what my life might look like if I allowed myself to dream again. With the proceeds from the sale, I made a decision that surprised even me. I found a small condo near the water, a place with wide windows and a balcony that overlooked the bay. The building was quiet, filled with people who, like me, seemed to be starting over in one way or another. I packed my things slowly, choosing carefully what to bring and what to leave behind. Each box felt like a small act of letting go, a way of honoring the past while making room for the future. I kept the letter from Emily, tucking it into a drawer with the other keepsakes, a photograph of her as a child, a pressed flower from my old garden, a note from my own mother written decades ago. Moving day arrived with little ceremony. A few friends from church helped me load the boxes into a rented van. Their laughter and easy conversation, a comfort in the midst of change. The new condo was smaller than my old house, but it felt just right. I arranged my furniture to catch the afternoon light. I hung a few favorite paintings and filled the kitchen with the scent of fresh bread. I planted herbs in pots on the balcony, watching as the green shoots reached for the sun. In the evenings, I would sit outside with a cup of tea, listening to the distant sound of gulls and the gentle hush of the water against the shore. As the days passed, I found myself settling into a new rhythm. I joined a book club at the local library, where I met women who shared stories of their own losses and new beginnings. I volunteered at a community garden, my hands in the earth, the simple work grounding me in the present. I began to look forward to the small rituals of daily life, the walk to the market, the quiet hour before dawn, the pleasure of a well-cooked meal. I realized that even after so much upheaval, I was still capable of joy. There were moments, of course, when the past would rise up and catch me off guard. A song on the radio, the scent of Emily's favorite flowers, the sight of a mother and daughter laughing together in the park. These things would bring a rush of memory, a pang of longing. I allowed myself to feel the sadness, to honor it, but I did not let it consume me. I had learned, over these long months, that grief and hope can exist side by side, that it is possible to carry both sorrow and gratitude in the same heart. Emily and I did not speak often in those first months. She sent a few short messages, updates about her new apartment, a photograph of a sunrise from her window, a note on my birthday. I replied with gentle encouragement, careful not to press too hard, to give her the space she needed. I knew that healing would take time, that trust, once broken, is slow to mend. I held on to the hope that in time, we would find our way back to each other, not as we once were, but as two women who had survived the storm and come out the other side changed, but not defeated. One afternoon in late summer, I received a postcard from Emily. The front showed a field of wildflowers, the colors bright and wild. On the back, she had written only a few lines, thinking of you. Mom, thank you for everything. I hope you're well. I held the card in my hands for a long time, tracing the letters with my finger, feeling the weight of all that was left unsaid. I placed it on the mantel, a small sign of hope, a reminder that the story was not yet finished. As the seasons turned, I found myself growing more comfortable with the uncertainty of the future. I learned to savor the quiet moments, to trust in the slow work of healing. I made new friends, tried new recipes, traveled to places I had always wanted to see. I spent a weekend at the coast, walking along the shore, letting the wind and salt air clear my mind. I visited an old friend in the mountains, sharing stories late into the night, laughing until we both cried. I realized that, even as I missed Emily, I was building a life that was full and meaningful in its own right. There were still days when the ache of loss would return, sharp and sudden. On those days, I would sit by the window with a cup of tea, watching the light change, letting myself remember. I would read Emily's letter or look at the postcard and remind myself that love is not always easy, that forgiveness is a journey, not a destination. I would whisper a prayer for her, for myself, for the possibility of a new beginning. As autumn arrived, I found myself drawn to the water more often. Sometimes I would walk along the bay in the early morning, the air crisp and clean, the world quiet and new. I watched the boats move slowly across the horizon, their sails bright against the sky. I thought of all the ways my life had changed, of the strength I had found in letting go, of the peace that had come from accepting what I could not change. One evening, as I sat on the balcony watching the sunset, and I felt a deep sense of gratitude. I was grateful for the years I had shared with Emily, for the lessons learned, for the love that had endured, even through hardship. I was grateful for the friends who had stood by me, for the kindness of strangers, for the beauty of the world around me. I was grateful, most of all, for the chance to begin again. I knew that the future would hold its own challenges, its own joys and sorrows. I did not know if Emily and I would ever be as close as we once were, or if we would simply move forward, each on our own path, connected by memory and hope. But I was no longer afraid of the unknown. I had learned to trust myself, to trust the slow, steady work of time and love. Sometimes, in the quiet of the evening, I would imagine Emily knocking at my door, her arms full of flowers, her eyes bright with forgiveness. One day, I would imagine us sitting together at the kitchen table, sharing stories, laughing at old memories, building something new from the pieces of the past. I did not know if that day would ever come, but I was ready to welcome it if it did. Until then, I would live each day with intention, with kindness, with hope. I would cherish the small joys, the quiet moments, the simple pleasures of a life rebuilt. I would carry Emily in my heart, always, a constant reminder of the power of love to heal, to endure, to begin again. And so, as the world turned and the seasons changed, I stepped forward into the future, not with certainty, but with courage, with grace, and with an open heart. And the story was not over. There were still pages to be written, still moments to be lived, still love to be given and received. I was ready, at last, for whatever came next. And as I watched the last light fade from the sky, I felt a quiet assurance that no matter what tomorrow might bring, I would meet it with hope, with strength, and with the gentle wisdom that comes from having let go and learned to begin again. There were evenings when I would light a candle and sit quietly, letting the soft glow fill the room. Thinking of all the women in my family who had come before me, my mother, my grandmother, and now Emily. I felt their presence in the hush of the night, in the steady beat of my own heart, in the courage it took to keep loving, to keep hoping, to keep moving forward. And in those moments, I knew that I was not alone, that I was part of something larger and more enduring than any one story, any one loss, any one beginning or end.